Tomorrow marks 50 years since Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. In the days following his death, violence broke out in cities across the country, including right here in the nation's capital. Bruce Johnson talked to people who lived through that tumultuous time to tell their story of what happened after Dr. King was shot.
Only way we can really achieve freedom.
Oh man, I was angry. Right. Yeah, I was real angry. And I wanted somebody to pay.
Is to somehow conquer the fear of death.
The last thing he said to me was, "Don't ever hang up your marching shoes."
And then the next thing you know,
he got killed the next day.
But if a man has not discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live.
Someone rushes in the door and says, "Dr. King has been shot."
And it shocked me so, I just screamed.
I was headed back home to my mother's house. This would have been that Thursday right before Palm Sunday, and I was going to have dinner, and I heard on the radio that he'd been shot.
Moved in January, Dr. King got killed in April, and looked like all hell broke loose.
when Dr. King was killed, we all went to the streets. If you were a teenager, and I was certainly a teenager back then, I was in the streets, not here in D.C., but in my hometown. I didn't burn anything down, but my friends certainly did. We were all out there. And if the National Guard, who were at the end of the block, had decided to fire into the crowds, they could have hit any one of us. We didn't care.
There wasn't no plan.
Right.
Everything just got out of control.
Just combustion, just things happening.
Yeah. Then they brought in the National Guard, and that made it even worse. Well, it's a couple of guys that grew up with me, they ain't here no more. They got shot going in and out of stores.
You could sort of smell it in the air.
Walter Washington was mayor of D.C. He eventually became the city's first elected mayor. He imposed a curfew, but not before, get this, 13 people killed, 1,000 people injured, over 6,000 people arrested, and the property damage in the billions of dollars.
After the sadness, frustration, and anger set in, and I believe the first brick was thrown in the People's Drug Store at 14th and U.
Virginia Ali today is probably one of the best known people in all of Washington. Back then, she was a young woman in her 30s, and along with her husband, Ben Ali, they were running a small restaurant store.
And we were pretty well established in the community. Ben did write on that window in a big marker, Soul Brother.
Soul Brother.
Yeah, that identified us as a black-owned business. I think other people did it as well.
You see that guy right there? You recognize him?
Yes, I do.
Bobby Walker babysat me the night of Martin Luther King's death in that rectory, opened up the drapes and said, "You ain't going nowhere tonight."
Bobby Walker was a member of a Catholic church, St. Paul and St. Augustine, right there in the area. And when the riots broke out, he immediately, with some of his friends, surrounded the church and the pastor there, Father Ray Kemp.
The kids from the neighborhood would not let the priests go out and see this because they didn't want anything to happen to us.
How long were you hunkered down here
About,
in St. Augustine?
We walked out at 2 a.m., 2:30 in the morning. There were flames licking the sky. It felt to me like we had been bombed along 14th Street.
I think for the black community, it was what made these communities erupt was that people just thought there was no way, they had no other recourse.
A lot of people who've arrived in D.C. in the last 20 or so years, they don't know much about Frank Smith, and his soft voice can be deceiving, but Frank Smith was a young warrior.
Well, I moved to Washington, D.C. in January of 1968, having completed 6 years of service in Mississippi in the Civil Rights Movement with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, picketing and marching and going to jails, to some of the best jail houses in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia.
He was a young member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC.
I'd seen a lot by then. I was in Mississippi when Meg Edwards got killed. I was there when I went to the funeral for the 4 girls that got bombed in Birmingham. You know, I've seen a lot of tragedy.
Frank Smith says he wasn't surprised when he heard that Dr. King had been killed. And from talking to him, I gather he didn't think Martin Luther King was all that surprised that he was going to be killed.
Dr. King had moved from Montgomery, Alabama, because his house was bombed. His family was bombed there. Moved his family to Atlanta so he could, to make them a little bit safer. He chose to stay. he chose to stay and fight because he believed it was his mission, it was his calling.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will.
If you know someone who is living out Dr. King's legacy, we want to hear about it. Just go over to WUSA9.com and use our app to tell us their story. Of course, we're going to go deeper into the life and legacy of Dr. King, his impact on our community and nation, starting tomorrow at 4:30 a.m.